Morning, Trader's Edge with high-tech trading analysis. I want to take just a little bit of time today to talk about my VWAP+ indicator. And I guess the first thing I'd like to do is compare the differences of my version versus the default version that comes in NinjaTrader 8. So as you can see, I have two charts here on the top. All I do is I have the default version of NinjaTrader 8 VWAP just loaded on a chart. Right click, indicators, OrderFlow Vwap, everything's default. Click OK. And I did the same thing with my indicator. Now, there is in the default indicator of NinjaTrader 8 two options that this can be run on. This can be run on a standard resolution or a tick resolution. Right now we're just running it on a standard resolution. Now what this means is whatever the bar series of whatever your primary bar series is, okay, whether it's a 5-minute or a 15-minute or a 30-minute or a 1-minute or a 10-tick or whatever it is, it's going to average the volume of that bar across all those price levels as it calculates VWAP through the day. Now, the first difference between this one and this one is I'm going to add a 1-minute data series to the background and do all my calculations on a 1-minute series. So what does this mean to you? Let's take a look at the values that we have here. This red and green line is VWAP in the default indicator, and this white dotted line is VWAP in my instance. So we see 13,673.11, and here we see 13,674.25. So all of my values, as you can see, are going to be rounded to the tick. I want to see what the tick value, the closest tick value to that is, not some arbitrary number that I've got to figure out. Because depending on what I'm looking at, whether I'm looking at crude or whether I'm looking at YM or whether I'm looking at ES or whether, or bonds, I don't want to have to think about this in my head. So the next issue that you have with running on this resolution is if we duplicate this window and we bring it down, and we're just looking at a duplicate of this up here, we're going to change our data series and we're just going to make it a 30-minute chart instead of a 15-minute chart. Notice that my values here, my second standard deviation, let's just say VWAP, 73. I'm off by about, that's 12 ticks almost. So just using the same default indicator on two different series that's 15 minutes apart, I'm 10 plus ticks difference between my charts. I can't have that. One of the things that I've done for myself long ago was decided that whatever I was going to put on one chart was going to be the same thing that I put on any other chart. I want to see the exact same values. If I'm looking at a 30-minute, if I'm looking at a 15-minute, if I'm looking at a 1,000 volume, if I'm looking at Aramco, if I'm looking at whatever I'm looking at, the values that I'm looking at on one chart need to match up to the other chart. Otherwise, that, for me, that just added confusion, and I had to take that out of the picture. So that's one advantage of adding the 1-minute data series to the back end of this, and that if I change this to a 30-minute chart, let's just take a look. We're at 74.50 and 40.75. 74.50 and 40.75. The other numbers I'm sure matched up as well. So whatever chart that I set this to, I am always going to have the same values, and I'm always going to have those accurate down to 1 minute. Now, up here in the default indicator, sure, we can come into the indicator properties and we can set this to be equal to each tick. The problem that we have in this, hang on 1 second. I've done this before and made the mistake. I think I'm loading 100 days on this. Let's come back in. You are not going to want to load 100 days of data on a chart and turn this to tick. You're going to be waiting about 5 minutes for your chart to load. Okay, now this is still going to take some time. I've only loaded 10 days worth of data. A couple seconds. Not too bad, but the more days you load, the more time it's going to take. The problem that I have is I'm not just looking at daily data. I am looking at weekly data and sometimes contract data. So in order for me to get weekly data, or let's just say the previous week's values, I have to have at least 15 days on my chart. If it's Friday, I've got to have all of these days, plus the weekend, plus Friday through the back Monday, plus I want to get to the Friday before. So I, at a minimum, pretty much have to load 30 days worth of data on every chart that I look at, no matter what it is. And then that, and using tick resolution is just not an option for me. Okay, but if we did change this, and let's just do that and see what happens. 74.71, 74.75. See, I'm only off by 4 cents, and if we round that to the tick, I'm exact using 1 minute versus 1 tick. But let's just change this to 30. We're looking at 74.71 and 40.85. Oh, and I might have made a mistake. I might have to pause this. This might have went back and loaded 100 days on this chart again. And if it did, it's going to take forever to load. Give me 1 second, please. Okay, wow. I hate that about NinjaTrader. Sometimes when you change data series of a chart, it automatically loads whatever you have saved in as by default. And I'm going to venture to say that took too long. I'm going to venture to say that went back and loaded 100 days worth of data. So now I forgot what numbers I was looking at. 74.71 and 40.85. Those are exact. So we changed the data series, and these will be exact across any chart. But you can see the issue that you're going to face if you're going to load any more than 5 or 10 days worth of data, and especially the issue you might face changing data series like that. I've got 100 days worth of data down here at the bottom. We can see that changing to any type of minute data series is going to be almost instant. Now, oh, I got 100 days. No, I'll change it to that. See, that's pretty instant too, but I don't really have, I don't think, a lot of days loaded here. Let's load 30 days worth of 1,000 volume. Now this down here is saying loading, so it's going out and getting the data. It's not calculating VWAP yet. Once the data was there, it's not instant, but extremely responsive. So let's take them back to compare. Let's take this one. Excuse me. Let's take this one back to standard before we do anything. Okay, and that'll be okay. But again, the problem is I'm the resolution, the higher, the bigger the bar you have, the worst accuracy you're going to have when it comes to using the default standard resolution. Now, this is about all that the default indicator gives you. Gives you VWAP in 3 upper and lower standard deviations, along with regions in between them and lines, and you can configure all of this stuff. So now that we've looked at a couple of those, let's look at the properties of my VWAP. So the first thing we can do is we can set the type of VWAP that we want to look at. I offer daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, contract, chart, and date. I think everything's pretty self-explanatory. Contract would only work on a futures instrument. They're the only thing that have expirations, right? This is NQ. If I were to set that on contract, well, let's load a few more minutes so that we can see that. We can see at the beginning of the contract, VWAP resets and develops through the end of this contract. And then if we scroll back, we can see the previous contract's VWAP. Let's just set that on a week for now. Let's go back to 15 minutes real quick. Come back into the indicator properties. We can set our standard deviation. So we don't have to look at just standard deviation of 1, 2, and 3. You can set that to your liking. Okay, all of my plots now, if we look inside of any of them, we now have an opacity. So now you can set the opacity of that line if you want. Why and how I would use that. I'm looking at a daily and a weekly VWAP on the same chart. I'm not changing the colors of the lines. I'm changing the opacity of the lines to tell the difference between what's daily and what's weekly. Because over here you can see that this is a weekly VWAP, weekly upper 1, weekly upper 2, weekly upper 3, and lower 1, lower 2, lower 3. If I change this to daily, it'll have a D. If I change this to monthly, it'll have an M, or yearly, it'll be a Y. So labels are another thing that I'll address here later, but I've color-coded everything on my chart so that I don't need labels. I don't want my chart's cluttered enough with everything that I look at. I don't need the labels on my chart because I know what it is I'm looking at just by the color and style that it's set to. Another hint for you. Okay, so that's just pretty much it. We've gone through settings and plots, regions. I actually allow you to color each region separately. And what I mean by that, this is the upper inner region, upper middle region, upper outer region, lower region. So I can color this region different than this region if I so choose. Simple enough. Midpoint settings. I allow you to put a little midpoint line here now, and in the last version I also allow you to make that to use a custom multiplier for that. Works nothing different than notice the midpoints here. I'm looking at the midpoint between the standard deviations. At least I am. Now you have that multiplier. This is the first standard deviation, a multiplier of 1, 1.5, 0.5. Now you can make all of these whatever you want. Labels give you the ability to make those as big or small in whatever color you want. It does have the ability to use in a strategy or with Bloodhound, it will it'll take an additional file and a reference, but most of my products have that capability. The reason that I have to put that in all of my products that are capable of using in a strategy is that if you're using this in a strategy, all the UI, all the, you can't load the icon, you can't load the menus, you can't load any of the user interface within the strategy. That all has to be kind of hidden, taken out. I do that through a little checkbox for you automatically in the back. Visual, hide text label. We see VWapPlus up here in the top. If I click that and say OK, we will no longer see that. Toolbar icon up here in the top. I place an icon in NinjaTrader's toolbar with all my products. I give you the ability to change the background and the foreground for when that's hidden and when that's shown to match your theme. The reverse icon, notice how this has white on the left. I've added a reverse icon on there to where I can apply that, and now that gave me the ability to tell the difference between daily and weekly on the same chart. That way I leave the default weekly and then I reverse it for day. But that's just me. This set values you won't see yet. It's something I'm working on for the future, but I would like to be able to take all these values. I'm already doing it. Setting those and then being able to use those in various other scripts, such as placing all these values on my DOM, but without having to place the entire indicator on the DOM. I've already got the values here. I just want to store them somewhere, and I want to use them somewhere else. And I'm working on that for all of my stuff. And then here at the bottom, it's just telling you the version and my website. So that covers the extent of what's in the properties menu. We'll back into that real quick. If you choose date, you'll be able to set a start date. If date's not chose, that just won't show up there in your properties. I just wanted to show that. It's just something that came to mind real quick. Here's the drop-down icon that I place in NinjaTrader's toolbar. The first thing that we can do through the drop-down icon is I no longer have to go back into the indicator properties to change this from daily to weekly. I wouldn't necessarily have to put daily and weekly on the same chart. I could just easily go back and forth, and you can see that there's not much, it doesn't take much to reload this chart between the data series. And I've got 100 days loaded on this chart. But you start adding a half a dozen other things that calculate other things, and then now going back and forth between data series and or charts becomes a little more cumbersome. Nothing like loading the default in a tick, but still I don't like necessarily having to wait 4 or 5 seconds for my chart to load. If we didn't want to see VWap, we could hide VWap individually. The next thing that I show is also missed VWaps. Let's take this to a daily level. Let's take this down. There's some right there. So what this is showing is VWap ended on that day right here. From that day forward, that's considered missed or naked. Just like a high or a low would be. That's that day high. Once we open, that's an open high until we come up and breach it. So once it breached it here, it was no longer open. No difference than VWAP. I'm just showing where previous VWAPs have never been touched. I'm showing the price and I'm showing the date. We can turn them on or off as you choose. Previous VWAPs. I show today's developing. I show yesterday's. I show the day before that. And I show the day before that. This is probably the best example here. This would have been the current developing VWAP. This would have been the previous day's VWAP. This would have been the previous day's VWAP. And this would have been the day before that. But we're showing you 4 VWAPs, literally. Now, again, if we want to look at, if we don't want to see them, we can turn them off as a group through clicking the Show Previous VWAPs. Or if we want to see them, but let's just say that I only want to see yesterday's. The rest of them I don't care about. We can also do that. Individually selected and or the entire group. Now we can do the same thing with the standard deviation lines. I'm never looking at that third standard deviation line. I mean, the idea is to play between the lines. I want to play between here and 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 just kind of back and forth, right? Okay, next. I'm going to jump all the way down to regions. I don't look at the outer, so I wouldn't look at that. I'm hardly ever looking at the middle region. And that's about, I've set my opacity a little lower than this. But that's about what my charts are looking like when I've got this applied. Outside of the previous, which I'm going to get to here in just a second, is I also show or allow you to show the previous standard deviations. What does this mean? This is yesterday's VWAP, upper 1, upper 2, upper 3. If we show the previous, we're actually drawing a line, and these will be static. They will not develop during the day. They are what was the previous days. And I shouldn't say they were what was the previous days, because if we look at it from a weekly standpoint, now we're looking at what the previous week's values were. Price came up, broke up higher. It's kind of riding the first standard deviation higher. Finally breaks down to come back to test VWAP, but doesn't get below last week's upper third standard deviation. I personally am more likely to look at the previous values on a weekly than I am on a daily. Just me. This seems, that line, our third standard deviation from last week, so far right now, seems to have been significant. If I come down and look at this, the second standard deviation also looks like where we've decided to break out, retrace back to test, and off it went. I find the weekly value significant. Okay, let's turn those off for a second. Let's go back to daily for a second, just so that we're seeing more stuff. And what's next? So we talked about our regions, our midpoints. We can show or hide them. I believe I allow you to adjust the length of the line in the properties. So if you want that line a little longer or a little shorter, you can do that. Now, I do not have those individually selectable. You can't turn one on and not the other. They're either on or they're off. Show labels. I allow you to show them or not. Again, I think I mentioned earlier, I do not look at these. Some people want them. The reset all is going to reset everything back to on. Okay, differences. How many different, the missed Vwaps, the previous Vwaps, the previous standard deviations, the difference being able to color above and below the indicators, the midpoints, the labels, the drop down, the easy configuration of being able to hide and show, the easy user configuration to be able to change between just through doing all of this without having to go into the indicator properties. All those are reasons that if you use VWAP, that you might consider wanting to look into my product versus using the defaults. So let's recap this just a bit.